Good evening, everybody. Hello. Hi. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. It's my pleasure to greet you on behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Center and BPL, the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are part of, and the Arts and Culture team BPL Presents that provides all of these programs to folks here and at the Central Branch. Tonight's program, Capturing Brooklyn's Gilded Age, is a kind of mashup that I really love, where we connect the Center for Brooklyn History's collections and the history that they tell to popular thinking and culture today. So the HBO series, The Gilded Age, has stamped on our brains images of the opulence of high society Manhattan at the turn of the century. Tonight we're crossing the river to Brooklyn for a look at those decades here, but not just a picture of the uber wealthy. To do this, we turn to the photography of a man whose name is not a household word, but should be, George Bradford Brainerd. The George Bradford Brainerd collection at the Center for Brooklyn History includes hundreds of extraordinary photographs, and to give proper credit, they're prints from original glass plate negatives that are held at the Brooklyn Museum. And these photographs were the primary material for Eric Hesselberg's new book, Candid New York, The Pioneering Photography of George Bradford Brainerd. I am delighted to welcome Eric here tonight to talk about what the Brainerd images reveal about post-Civil War Brooklyn, from the opulent buildings to the gritty street life. It was a time when Brooklyn was exploding into modernity, and Brainerd captured all of it in ways that truly broaden our assumptions about the Gilded Age. I am thrilled that Eric's conversation partner tonight is someone who is steeped in Gilded Age knowledge, Esther Crane. Esther is the founder and creative force behind the website and blog Ephemeral New York, and the author of the magnificent book, The Gilded Age in New York. And we have copies of both Eric's Candid New York and Esther's The Gilded Age in New York available at the CBH shop in the corner over here, and the two of them will be in the front of the room here where you entered to sign copies following the program. Just a quick word about Eric. He has written about the Connecticut River for 30 years, first as an environmental reporter for the Connecticut-based Middletown Press, and later as executive editor of Shoreline newspapers in Guilford, Connecticut. He traveled here from Connecticut. Thank you for that. While he was president of the Middlesex County Historical Society, he developed the award-winning exhibit, A Vanished Port, about the colonial port of Middletown and its connection to the slave economy of the Caribbean islands. And his first book is Night Boat to New York, Steamboats on the Connecticut, 1850 to 1932. And as if all of that is not cool enough, he is grandson of the Oscar-winning actor Melvyn Douglas, born Melvyn Hesselberg. Therefore, he also writes quite a bit about the history of entertainment and popular culture. Esther launched Ephemeral New York in 2008. There she writes and publishes stories every week that explore the city's past. She speaks regularly on topics related to New York City history and conducts historical walking tours of Riverside Drive, Ladies Mile, the Bowery, Gilded Age, Fifth Avenue, and many more of New York's hidden pockets and little-known corners. Finally, I want to let you know that after their conversation and presentation, we're going to turn to you and your questions. Our ushers will bring a mic to you in your seats. Please help us out by standing when you speak and keeping your questions as brief as possible. So I'm super excited for this program and to hear and see what you guys have. Please help me welcome now Eric Hesselberg and Esther Crane to the stage.
Check. Marcia mentioned my grandfather Melvin, and I have a slight connection to Brooklyn that I can mention. His second wife was Helen Gahagan Douglas, who famously ran against Richard Nixon in the 1950s in California, and she was a Brooklyn gal. She grew up on Park Slope, and she always talked about the brownstone that she grew up in. She was an actress early on. Her father was a pretty prominent engineer who had built railroads and was involved in Brooklyn shipping. But I remember as a kid going up and visiting them that she always talked about her Park Slope apartment. I don't know Park Slope. I understand it's a pretty Tony neighborhood, but is it still nice, Park Slope? Okay. So anyway, that's my Brooklyn connection.
Okay. Does this sound good to everybody? Okay. So thank you very much, Marcia, for that introduction. I can't think of a better place to talk about Brainerd's photos and talk to Eric and talk about the Gilded Age in Brooklyn than the Center for Brooklyn History. Perfectly appropriate place. Super excited to be here as well. I guess we could start off with the first slide. Let me see how's this work? Oh, good. Eric, tell us a little bit about George Brainerd. Give us a snapshot of just a biographical. This is a Brooklyn. Sure. This is a lifelong Brooklyner, except when he was very young. And he comes from a fairly privileged family. But tell us some more.
Sure. First, let's see. Is he on? He's on the.
Yeah.
He's on your left. He's with the high-crowned hat, eating a peach, I believe. And that's how a photographer went out and took pictures in those days. Photography in Brainerd's time was almost an aristocratic pursuit. So it was very costly. So it was something that well-to-do families did. So George Brainerd, as Esther said, George comes from the Brainerd family, a very prominent family in my hometown of Haddam, Connecticut. We still have the Brainerd Library. They were the original founders of the town. I think the Brainerds came over with John Winthrop in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then they settled in Hartford, and then they moved down to the Connecticut River. George's father was named Deodate, which means God-given, and he was, I think, a merchant originally, made money probably in the West Indies trade, and then he invested in quarrying, where we have like a very unusual kind of blue granite, and he owned a number of quarries. He also was in the feldspar business. He shipped feldspar, which is a key ingredient in the porcelain industry. So he was quite successful. And as a number of New Englanders began to do when shipping moved either to the bigger ports like Boston or New York, he followed them. And he decided to move to Brooklyn, and he became one of the most prominent real estate developers of the time, buying up farms, on speculation. So George grew up on the Connecticut River. Well, he was born on the Connecticut River. He moved to Brooklyn when he was just 2 years old. But one thing that's very important, the Brainerds maintained very close ties with their hometown. In fact, all of the Brooklyn Brainerds, many of them are buried in Haddam Neck on the Connecticut River. So they really thought of their home as the Connecticut River. And I think George Brainerd did as well. And so he kind of has a foot in both camps. He is both very interested in the explosive growth of the city and all this technology and innovation, but he also spends 2 or 3 months on the Connecticut River in a very rural town. So he has those two interests, and I always kind of see George Brainerd as looking at the city as a traveler, as a tourist might, with a sense of wonderment and a sense of kind kind of what I do when I come to the city. You know, I'm looking all around, and it's exciting. He has this kind of childhood curiosity that I think comes from growing up a kid on the Connecticut River, fishing, swimming in quarries, and this is a kind of a new and exciting place for him. So that's pretty much his background. His Bradford name comes from his mother, who is like the 8th descendant of William Bradford, the founder of the Plymouth colony. So quite a patrician pedigree.
He wouldn't have been unusual as sort of a New England family coming down into Brooklyn.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. A number of the China, the families that made money in the China trade moved to Brooklyn and settled in Brooklyn Heights, where they could see their ships docked, on the Manhattan shore.
And Brainerd grew up in Clinton Hill, right?
He grew up in Clinton Hill.
Yeah.
We don't know too much about his early childhood, except that he went to what were called French primary schools. So foreign languages were important. He eventually mastered 12 languages, foreign languages, geology, mineralogy, technology, things like that, I'm guessing.
What I'm struck by with him reading your book is that this is somebody who at 12 years old was interested in photography, built his own camera out of a cigar box and the lenses from opera glasses. So I like to think that if he was alive today, he'd be, like an AI genius or some kind of tech person. But tell us about the cameras that he developed.
So this is the only patent George Brainerd received, and he didn't receive that patent until around 1884. And there are other what were called detective cameras before his. What's interesting to note, though, is he applied for this patent late, and we know that he built a camera that was a handheld camera that had an exposure fast enough that you could take what was at the time called an instantaneous photograph. So, and then later they began to be called snapshots. So he built this camera. He built the camera to photograph surreptitiously the displays at the Centennial Exhibition of 1876 in Philadelphia. And the concession for photography was given over to one company. So there were police that patrolled, and you weren't allowed to bring a camera in, and you weren't even allowed to sketch any of the exhibits. So Brainerd, being an engineer, he's clearly interested in seeing all this new technology that's on display. So he devises a camera which is disguised as a book that he can sneak in. He's probably stopped at the gate, and what is that? He goes, well, it's just a package. See, and it was actually it had a lens inside it. So that was his original motivation for this kind of detective camera.
For the detective camera, he essentially invented it.
Yeah.
But Kodak gets the credit.
Well, there are some earlier What's interesting to note is that every camera, the camera that we might call an Instamatic, a camera that was capable of taking a snapshot, every early handheld camera was called a detective camera because the original purpose was to be used by the police to record perhaps crimes in progress or photographs of pickpockets and things like that. So every handheld camera is called a detective camera. The other thing, of course, is that they tended to be small and concealed.
And they could take people without that person knowing, which I think brings us to this remarkable photo.
Yeah.
And these are runners in Brooklyn or Manhattan?
We don't really know. I think that this is New York, but these are runners or sprinters, and they're running quite fast. What Brainerd is doing is he's already in 1878, which is really early. He's perfected a camera that he can take probably an exposure of 1/200th of a second or 1/250th of a second. So enough to freeze runners sprinting, which was pretty fast. And the following slide, the person that gets credit for doing this is Edward Muybridge, who's, his famous photographs of animals in motion and humans in motion. But Muybridge he hadn't really perfected this until maybe the mid-1880s, Brainerd had done it years earlier.
So Brainerd graduates college. He's now a civil engineer.
Civil engineer.
Comes back to Brooklyn and gets a job on the docks. Tell us what he was doing.
Brainerd had the job, he was called Deputy Purveyor of Water. And
Fancy term for...
Deputy Purveyor of Water. And I wondered, what could that possibly be? And I was able to, I think at the Brooklyn Museum, there was some early biography that was written by a friend, and he explained what the Deputy Purveyor of Water was. The Deputy Purveyor of Water, it was his job to get fresh water to all the ships coming in. They needed fresh water for their travels. They might dock in Brooklyn and leave for 3 months, on a sealing expedition, or who knows. They were, ships left Brooklyn for China.
It's good that it was a job that gave him some free time, or we wouldn't have all of these great dock photos, right? So this picture here, this would be today's Red Hook, correct?
This is Red Hook, and I think this is called the Erie Basin.
Yeah.
Named for the fact that most of the cargo is coming down from the Erie Canal. And the Brooklyn docks, the Erie Basin, and I think the Atlantic docks were built largely to handle grain shipments from the Erie Canal. And there were these massive grain silos with grain elevators. We can see like early pictures of these. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is around the time when Brooklyn's waterfront, well, first it exploded in the 1840s and 50s with incredible industry, and through the Gilded Age kept growing and growing.
Yeah.
I looked up this, what does it say, Finlay's stores, because I was curious, and it turns out that at the time this photo was taken, there was a strike by the men working in that warehouse. They were striking because they wanted a raise from 20 cents an hour to 25 cents. The management promised them that and then didn't pay it to them. That would mean, though, that they were making, less than $500 a year, which is about what a working man made at the time. And, having a raise of 5 cents an hour would really make a difference in your living situation. It's really incredible.
Yeah. One quick little thing I'll say about this photograph is that we know it was a snapshot, that it was an instantaneous photograph. That means less than a second exposure, because we can see the ripples in the water. Now, whenever wet plate photography, which use long exposures, and you can take beautiful photographs, but they tend to be 10-second exposures, 20 seconds, even 4 or 5 minutes. And the characteristic about a wet plate picture of like the East River or something is a glassy surface. Whereas here we see the ripples of the water. We know that he was able to use a fast exposure, and he wants to get the men rowing in the boat.
So let's see, are they loading, unloading?
This is one where I think he might actually be documenting his work. It's quite possible that they are loading fresh water onto a ship.
Mm-hmm. This looks about like the kind of wrecks that you might have seen on the Brooklyn waterfront in the 1970s and 80s before the revival. But
this is a huge to get a. I don't know if you can see it. We don't have a pointer, but you'll see these little tiny figures there. Those are men working on the side of the ship, up there. See them? That gives you an idea of the size of this ship. The Brooklyn docks were famous for what were called graving docks, for ship repair. So the very largest steamboats on Long Island Sound, boats that were 400 feet long, were worked on in Brooklyn. And a graving dock uses a lock system. A gate, the boat sails in, and then a gate comes up, and the water is let out. And it allows you to turn the boat on its side, like they're doing, and scrape the hull, work on the hull, without hauling the ship out completely.
Now, this is an incredible photo. The cables of the bridge, just starting to go up. What a wonderful moment.
Yeah.
Because the bridge wouldn't open until 1883, so they have quite a lot of work ahead of them.
This is the first cable strung across, and I think the Brooklyn Daily Eagle ran a headline that said "wedded," meaning the two shores had finally been joined.
I wish I knew what Brainerd was thinking when he took the photo. Just does he know how revolutionary this is going to be?
I think he does. I think Brainerd, as an engineer, he's always interested in celebrating these engineering marvels that he's seeing all around him. The Brooklyn Bridge, was just, you can't say enough about what a triumph it was. And I think he decides to, memorialize that with getting the first cable strung across. This photograph here says this was taken from the tower. So Brainerd was able, probably having friends, he was able to climb up on the scaffolding or whatever ladder system to get this photograph. And I'm guessing that is the Brooklyn shore.
I think so, yeah.
Now, here again, you see the glassy water. That's a wet plate image, so it's a long exposure. You can enlarge this thing and see the details of the lettering on the sides of the building. It's
great, too, because you can see that the rest of Brooklyn is still pretty undeveloped at this time.
Yeah.
Not for long, but, in the 1870s, Brooklyn really didn't extend beyond where Prospect Park was. Brooklyn as an urban center, that is.
Quick mention here, a lot went on. Brooklyn, the Brooklyn docks, I guess this is the Red Hook area, famous for ship repair and unloading of grain, but it was also a place of activity, of fun, where you could rent rowboats and the shack, I believe, says sandworms for sale and sailboats or boats to let. So the other thing I'll say about this is Brainerd, more than, he's an innovator in terms of developing these remarkable cameras, and almost that's enough. But he's also a master photographer. It's just a beautiful composition. Some of them almost seem set up, and they're not. It's a snapshot, the way he gets the man in the rowboat. He's very conscious of what artists tend to look for, is to have something going on in each plane, foreground, middle ground, and background. And he's very attentive to having some activity always going on.
And that makes me wonder, does he have any training at all as an artist, as a painter?
I'm thinking he must have. That he went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He was an engineer, so he learned how to draw. And he was also a collector he was very interested in botany, and kind of botany goes hand in hand with sketching. So I'm thinking, and then Brooklyn is, as Esther and I were talking about, maybe it's a time to talk about Brooklyn at this point being...
Brooklyn, people forget what a world-class independent city Brooklyn was in the 1870s and 1880s. You have artists like William Merritt Chase lived here, painted Prospect Park. There are artist societies, there's salons, there's the forerunner of the Brooklyn Museum, Brooklyn Academy of Music. We always think of New York City as Manhattan, as the cultural center, but there was so much going on in Brooklyn that equaled that. Theater, all the arts, lots of culture. Brainerd would have probably found his place among that, in that world.
I think he did. And what Brooklynites, I understand, also were always trying to one-up Manhattan if they could.
The fun rivalry of Brooklyn and Manhattan.
Yeah.
So Manhattan was the #1 most populated city in America. Brooklyn was third, but by the end of the 1880s, Brooklyn had almost 1 million people. I mean, that's really coming up to what Manhattan had at the time. Mm-hmm. So Brainerd then gets interested in street types, as he called them, right?
Right.
Street folk.
Once again, I think Brainerd he's a very modern person. So he develops a camera. First of all, he's traveling by trolley to work, horse-drawn trolley, but nonetheless Brooklyn is like the first commuter city, isn't it, in America? I think it was
I think Brooklyn Heights. for
Brooklyn
sure.
Heights. So he's traveling around, and he wants he wants a camera that he can bring along to work. He's also overseeing the laying of water pipe. So he uses the opportunity to photograph workers tearing up streets. And I believe this is Clinton Street. I don't know where Clinton Street is, probably.
Like a block or two away.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Clinton Street. That was identified.
I just wish we knew the cross street.
Yeah. And once again, I'll say both these photographs, again, a snapshot and yet beautifully composed.
Mm-hmm.
The way I think this one here with the gentleman with his arm kind of swinging, the other person leaning on the
Yeah. Can anyone recognize that church?
Clinton Street again, I believe.
Brooklyn is the city of churches, so. What are they laying down? What is the type of pavement? I mean, it's not asphalt, right? That's a little early for asphalt.
Most of it's cobblestone, I guess. I'm guessing from. No, not. Are they? Macadam? Okay.
Yeah.
They just ripped up Remsen Street to repave it, and when they went down, they found all the cobblestones.
Oh, wow.
Just 2 blocks away.
That's very cool.
Okay. So Macadam possibly over. Okay.
Take a little field trip out there.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite photographs because the other thing that Brainerd is a master of, his photographs, and every photographer hopes to do that, hopes that his or her photograph will tell a story. Brainerd's photographs always tell a story. I don't know what the story is in this photograph, I have to say, but it's called stevedore. So the gentleman peering at something is a dock worker. So this was taken near the docks. The woman who is holding a board, I believe a friend or companion is in an outhouse, and she's guarding the door. And then there looks like there's some delivery of something in the background.
And then the bridge is in the background too.
Oh,
Yeah.
there it is. Okay.
It helps place it a little bit.
Is it? Another, Brainerd again, interested in trades, capturing trades. And this was identified as tin workers. You can see the spar of a ship, so we know it's on the waterfront. And I'm guessing this was somehow related to ship, some kind of ship work. Okay.
The bark woman.
The bark woman.
Yeah. Why is this woman collecting bark?
Yeah, that was a good question. I mean, I know my father, who was a chemist and a physicist, of course, he taught me very early on that hemlock bark was used for tanning, especially hemlock. So the bark lady is undoubtedly collecting bark for the tanning, for early tanning process. So the other thing that's worth noting is how much bark she's carrying. And there is an enormous bundle on her back. You don't even really see. And then there's more under her arm, and then there's another load in her basket, and she looks like as casual as could be, trudging up the hill, and it's monumental almost. I think Brainerd saw the bark lady as almost like a German fairy tale.
I'm struck by how this is somebody that was born into a lot of privilege, but he seems to find so much humanity in people that work jobs that, frankly, collecting bark had to be terrible.
Yeah.
And these are jobs that no longer exist as they've been replaced by, newer technologies, and they're not needed. But what a hard existence.
Yeah.
Yet he finds this sense of, this woman is worth taking a photo of, and with this dignity of her job.
And I think he sees that. The other thing I would just point out, too, is that in the left-hand corner there.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, quick. Yeah, just really quickly.
Yeah.
There's Brainerd's shadow.
Oh,
See
I was
it?
going to ask that. Right.
There's his bowler hat. He always wore a bowler hat. And so he's got the sun behind him, and we see a little bit of, he's kind of left his fingerprints on that photograph there.
And this is another remarkable photo of a man doing a job that had to be horrible and no longer exists anyway. So tell us about the soap fat man.
This is the soap fat man, and Brainerd counted this as like a milestone in his photography. It was taken fairly early, around 1878, and he said that he had finally captured someone walking with his foot off the ground and without any motion blur, and that's what he was trying to do. But I think he kind of undersells himself, because it's, if I look, I think many people looking at this photograph might say, oh, 1930s WPA, Margaret Burke White or something like that, or Bernice Abbott. It looks like a 1920s or 1930s photograph. Isn't it? And I think this might be Prospect Park. Is there a spot, a high point, where it seems to be a park above, at a high point in Brooklyn? Fort Greene Park. There you go. Okay.
I was going to say it could have been Prospect Park only because the park at the time when it was built and completed, it had that English landscape kind of look, the way that they did Central Park, Vaux and Olmsted, and which has been redone, so many times. But yes, I think Fort Greene Park, that makes sense with the high elevation.
Right. Now, this is another wonderful photograph. This photograph is called The Candy Man. And I don't know what little child would approach this gentleman to buy candy.
Very,
I mean, he looks
sinister little.
He looks like a bare knuckles prize fighter. And his nose, I think, looks like it's been broken repeatedly. The Candy Man. But once again, and Brainerd, he captures a little bit of that kind of menacing quality that this gentleman has, with seated there with his little flag, and then another brilliant arrangement of the figure, the middle ground, and then the horse, the tired mare in the distance, kind of waiting for someone.
I will say he does look a little creepy, but it just does show you how so much of the way that commerce is back then is the way it is today, with vendors on the street just trying to sell their wares. This, would not be out of place today. It would be somebody setting up a table and selling candy. And here's a street musician.
Street musician, another kind of classic street type, that photographers would have wanted to. This could be a father and a daughter, could be a husband and wife. Another sense of mystery, the way the player, the musician himself, is hidden behind the accordion, and then his partner, who might be collecting the money, is kind of regarding the photographer a little quizzically or annoyed, perhaps even.
The rag man.
The rag man.
Staple of the Gilded Age, the underside of the Gilded Age. Tell us about the rag man.
All we know, the photograph was identified as the rag man, and Brainerd took several photographs of him. So he clearly was someone well known in Brooklyn. What's interesting about the rag man is it's one of the few full-on portraits, where he actually stopped and took a portrait of someone.
I love that he also has a whole bunch of photos of Brooklyn at play. And the whole idea of leisure time and leisure activities and recreation is really a Gilded Age invention. So here we have the ice skaters, which of course was a hugely popular activity at the time, and one of the very few social activities in the Gilded Age that men and women could do together. If you had a beau or male friends, or you no longer had to be like supervised by your parents in their parlor or go to a dance or a ball. You were free to skate with them, which is really, sort of the evolution of the way the sexes get along.
Yeah. The other thing that's remarkable about this photograph, because it's a snapshot, we think of there's some story that people in general, or especially women, didn't smile in the Victorian era, and there's all sorts of excuses given for that. You know, one is poor dental hygiene, but Brainerd, because this photograph is taken secretly, this couple probably do not know they're being photographed. The woman is like squealing with delight as
She should be. She's being pushed in a chair, in an ice chair. I love it.
a skating chair, which was a kind of a invention just for the time.
If the weather ever gets cold enough where we'll have like a pond frozen over, I mean, I want one of those. But yeah, ice skating really lends itself to remarkable photos. This is a nice family on the ice.
This is another one too, where we can see Brainerd's kind of attention to composition. Andre Kertész, you know, photographer, when is Kertész? Maybe the 20s or the 30s. Very interested in high-angled shots where he could, and high contrast exposures where he could kind of really create patterns. And Brainerd clearly wanted to get the pattern of the figures on the white background. So he climbs up on something to get that high angle shot.
Do we know where this pond is?
I believe this is Prospect Park.
Okay. Oh, this is a fun one.
This is a fun one too. Once again, Brainerd, you know, he's taking, kind of celebrating middle-class leisure, but he's also traveling through some of these, some of the slums, some of these tenement neighborhoods, and through one of them, passing through one, he sees boys sliding on these tin cans, kind of their homemade little sleds, and he captures that moment.
Brooklyn's answer to Gilded Age Fifth Avenue. That's a beautiful, beautiful house, but no longer with us, correct?
Good question.
I think this was
It was called the
demolished.
Packard Mansion, Brooklyn Heights, and I think it's gone.
Yeah, and the Packards were a merchant family?
The Packards he was a buyer for a big New York department store.
The A.T. Stewart store.
Okay, yes. And but also in a very old New England family. You know, the daughters were debutantes, and the Packards. There's another photograph of a sleigh that the Packard family used. So all their friends in the neighborhood, when they had to travel in winter, would get on this sleigh. And it would depart from the Packard mansion.
And the Packards, of course, was the school. There's the Packard. Forget the name of this institute? Okay. Now, this is a church that I know can't be with us anymore, but I could not find where this was in Brooklyn.
And I couldn't either. I searched. What I did find an article, it was called Scudder's Iron Church, and it was some landmark. Brainerd was always interested in unusual, eclectic, architecture. Things like Eidlitz was another famous architect from that period who kind of mixed styles. And this was an iron-fronted church, and it was a great cathedral that was something of a landmark. And so I think Brainerd was interested in recording this great cathedral that was once here.
And Brooklyn had lots of religious communities. The churches and the men who led them were almost world famous. I mean, we all know about Beecher, of course, but there were others that would just have packed crowds every Sunday.
And this fellow Scudder I think he was a missionary who had come back, made a lot of money, and then built a church, and maybe 1,000 people came to hear his sermons.
It is a big church. This is a beautiful photo as well. Tell us about the Delaplane mansion.
This is, when I first saw this, I didn't really kind of understand the significance. But then I thought, let me just who was it was called the Delaplane House. And I looked them up, and I was able to find that the Delaplanes, there's an earlier picture.
Here it is.
On Gowanus Bay. And it was considered such a beautiful mansion that it was painted in the 1840s. And we can see that kind of early pastoral picture. So I think Brainerd was interested in capturing Brooklyn as it transformed, and this was the house is now reduced to hotel status.
And this is Gowanus Bay in today's Sunset Park, I believe.
Okay.
So the Delaplanes were a very old French Huguenot family that came here in the 17th century. So I like that he bridges, the past, this house, this totem of a family that came here to escape religious persecution and, found themselves very prosperous in Brooklyn. Greenwood Cemetery.
Yes, one of the few photographs that I found of Greenwood Cemetery, I had to put it in there. I wish that the distance was a little sharper, but just a beautiful shot of the waterfront and the ships in the distance as well.
Yeah, and Greenwood was essentially the city's park before Prospect Park. And people would go on picnics, and it seems a little ghoulish to us today, but it really started to usher in the whole idea of green spaces as very important to people's livelihoods and health. Prospect Park.
Yeah, this and there were other photographs of Brainerd loved to take photographs of parks in the snow, so there were a number of pictures of Prospect Park. This one showing some type of pavilion, very rustic. Maybe it was even designed by Olmsted himself. This particular pavilion.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar as the park as I wish that I was, but I don't recognize it, and I wonder if it's, part of that early stage of the park that's supposed to be like an English pastoral landscape.
I think so.
And then when, in the 1890s with the City Beautiful movement, there was sort of like this new type of architecture that came in. And then I think Robert Moses took a hand at it as well.
This photograph was identified as Prospect Park Dump. And I kind of juxtaposed these. At first, I was like very shocked by it. Almost seemed like these were folks scavenging for food. But as I began to read a little bit about the history, picking among the refuse in a dump was actually was a job. So there was a number of things that people could find and resell, like the rag man. So this is kind of in that tradition. So Brainerd takes the picture kind of respectfully from a distance, but he wants to capture, I think, this other side of Brooklyn, what's going on here. Same thing with this photograph here, 4th Avenue shanties. This is the way it's described. Does anyone know where this might be? I'm not sure. But there was a tradition. Walt Whitman, when he was the editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, wrote about visiting a shanty. And so there was a tradition, in journalism, which I think Esther and I were talking about, where the journalists were really the first kind of pioneered this interest in how the other half lives, in a sense, or probing dark and spooky neighborhoods and shanties. There was almost like tent villages of the time, and so Brainerd. Journalists did this and wrote about it, and I think Brainerd, was carrying on that tradition in photography.
And then this would have been 20 years before Jacob Riis did How the Other Half Lives, and took those wonderful photos. But those were all staged. Yeah. These are all candid, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Early Coney Island.
Yeah, this is a wonderful photograph. Brainerd took more photographs of Coney Island than any other subject. He loved it. He obviously knew Coney Island from its earliest days. And this is, probably everyone from Brooklyn knows who George Tilliou was, I imagine. If you saw Rick Burns' Coney Island, George Tilliou was the founder of Steeplechase Park. Probably the most famous ride on Coney Island. Well, I didn't know that Tilliou's parents, Peter and Ellen Tilliou, they began with like this little shack selling clam chowder for 25 cents and bathing suits and other things you might need to go for a swim at Coney Island. So Brainerd captures the very early Coney Island when it was still just a pretty remote place. In fact, it was so remote that Melville rented a place out there to write some of Moby Dick, and Walt Whitman could be seen declaiming to seagulls on the beach. That was one description of Coney Island in its early days.
And this is before the great amusement parks, Luna Park, and so Steeplechase Luna Park. I'm forgetting the other one.
Dreamland.
Dreamland,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
But it is becoming a recreation center with a little bit of an edge, which I think it still kind of has.
So much. Well, in the book I have a description where by 1860 a visitor to Coney Island from one of the newspapers was calling it a disreputable place. 1860, and not a place that you'd bring your sister or a lady friend.
I love the umbrellas, boy.
Yeah.
Look at that.
This is very interesting because it's. I've also written about kind of the growth of the seaside resort culture, which really emerges out of the inland spa culture. People haven't been going to the seaside forever. They only started really around 1750, and in this country, probably not till the 1820s. And the first thing that folks did when they got to the beach was dress nicely, like in city clothes, and just promenade. So that really shows those early days of not even swimming. Yeah. And then Brainerd again, here we can see him capturing a scene that, except for the Victorian swimming attire, looks much like today.
It's also very much like sort of the ash can painters, you know.
Exactly. Robert Henri, who I think is one of the founders of the Ashcan School, it probably wasn't. Henri doesn't paint scenes like this until the 1890s. So Brainerd is doing this so many years earlier.
And that's a lovely photo.
Yeah.
In the background, it's
with the umbrellas and
the black,
the
It must have
parasols.
been hot.
This is kind of, I think, almost represents bringing Coney Island up to date. This, I think, a lovely photograph of probably a husband and wife emerging from the water, and there seems to be kind of almost an intimate moment that they're sharing. And
They're wearing the new bathing attire that all of the department stores are selling.
right, which is a little bit more. His arms are now. You were seeing a little more skin.
A little more. I think she's still wearing stockings, but you know.
Yeah. I think wool tights were worn under kind of a woolen flannel dress.
Doesn't sound comfortable. That's all I can tell you.
Couple of the great hotels, Manhattan Beach Hotel from 1880.
Now this is the other end. Coney Island has the sort of seedy edge, and then these were built more for middle class men and women who now have this new thing called vacation time.
Right. This is the fashionable part of Coney Island. And this is really, when I saw this photograph of Austin Corbin's Oriental Hotel, it's one of the few photographs I've seen, a number of sketches, but it's just, I mean, it's like some fairyland castle.
This really struck me as well because I've never been able to see a photo. I've never found a photo of it. This is the first one.
The first one. And the date is 1879, and the hotel didn't open until 1880. So I believe that it's still under construction. Another very significant photograph. This is identified as an African-American family, middle class, well-dressed, having a picnic on Coney Island. Brainerd, that he decides to capture this moment, I think he wants to talk about really the democratic spirit which prevailed at Coney Island, where it was a place where all types, all races, and all immigrant backgrounds came together and felt comfortable. I close with this one. I'm not sure quite where this is. Perhaps the Dumbo area someone was selling, that might be, with Brooklyn in the distance. That is probably Brainerd himself. He set up the camera and he wanted to get a figure in, but it's another it's another photograph where, that this was taken in 1880 seems surprising.
And this is toward the end of his life.
This is toward the end of his life, right?
So
Yeah, and that the sad kind of note of George Brainerd's story is that by his late 30s, early 40s, he died at just 41 of a throat tumor, and it most likely brought on by exposure to the toxic chemicals that he had been working with. And here's what he does in the last years of his life. In order to study his tumor, he designs a camera to be able to photograph the larynx. And if you look up medical books, Brainerd he's probably more famous among physicians than he is among photographers, because he designed the first camera to take a picture of the human larynx in action. So he's also a pioneer in medical imaging.
So before we turn over questions to the audience, I just have one question for you.
Sure.
Why don't we know Brainerd better? Why is his name new to so many people?
Well, Brainerd was kind of discovered and then forgotten about and then discovered again. He didn't leave behind any prints. He left behind glass negatives. And these glass negatives, a couple hundred, somehow ended up in the basement of the Brooklyn Museum. And then in the early 1900s, it wasn't called the Brooklyn Museum then, I guess it was called the Academy of
Arts and Science,
yes.
or something like that.
And then in the early 1900s, a box of several thousand slides were found in a house that was about to be torn down. And those too were donated to the Brooklyn Museum. And they stayed in the basement until the 1930s, when the Brooklyn Museum's first director of photography, Herman de Witter, who was an Estonian aristocrat, who lost his job and was kind of down on his luck, but he had this patrician pedigree, and so Brooklyn Museum hired him, and he was also a photographer. And it's de Witter that discovers the Brainerd slides. He has a few printed out, and he realizes that this is a treasure. So in the 1930s, Brainerd enjoyed kind of a brief popularity. This is also important to remember. This is Bernice Abbott is taking pictures of New York City at the time.
It almost feels like Bernice Abbott really was inspired by him. I can see her forgotten New York photos are very similar in style. The sort of documentarian.
And Bernice Abbott, the other person that's mentioned is the Frenchman Auger, Eugene Auger, who was a pioneer street photographer. And Brainerd is in a sense, and Bernice Abbott bought Auger's collection when he died. So she brought those, she really introduced Auger to the world. But also Walker Evans. Walker Evans is living in Brooklyn in the 1930s. Did Walker Evans. Brainerd's photography is also it anticipates Walker Evans, what came to be known as vernacular photography.
Well, this is, these are just a small example. I can say Eric's book is many more photos, and it's very gracefully and beautifully written. So definitely recommend it to people.
Thank you so much, Esther. This has been such a pleasure to talk about.
We could basically talk all night.
Yeah, I know.
Do we want to go to audience questions?
What was the rag man doing, and what did he do with the rags? What was the rag man doing, and what was done with the rags?
Well, interestingly, he's called the rag man, and they were also called rag and bone men. So they weren't collecting just rags. They were junk men. So he's collecting all sorts of cast-off items, shoes, fur, anything that he could sell. So some of it was fabric, like we see in Dickens. But also pretty much a rag man or rag and bone man was a junk dealer, essentially. He's going around, he's a picker He's picking up scrap, all sorts of scrap to resell for some.
So he would be able to resell it to say like, they were like sort of scrap metal guys, like they would take, they would pay you pennies, but if you spent the whole day looking for tin cans and, all kinds of, odds and ends to recycle, you could eke out a living that way. There's a wonderful scene in the movie of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn where they're selling scrap metal for pennies, the two little kids. So that's fiction, but I think is inspired by the real life junk dealers of the time. Anyone else? Oh.
Yeah, just a couple of questions on process. How big are these glass plates? Did he make many prints, or was it a difficult process in his day to make a print of the photograph? And then today, do people, is the Brooklyn Museum making prints or not?
Well, there's, I almost don't want to say this, but there are about another 1,000 slides or glass plates that haven't even been printed, that are still, which I'm dying to see. So the one thing we don't know is some of these photographs are so beautifully composed. I wonder if he had an image that he didn't like, if he wouldn't have destroyed the plate, but he would have stripped off the emulsion and reused the glass. That's what I'm guessing he did. And when we know that when he showed these plates to friends, he often used what are called lantern slides. So when the photography groups or clubs got together, they would often project these slides. So they would perhaps, a lantern slide is a positive. These are negatives, but perhaps he would turn it into a positive and then project it. He might have had prints, but none of them have survived. They're small. They're they're kind of classic postcard size almost, and even smaller. Like 2 1/4 square at times, and then of course you saw some of those stereoscopic, So he did a lot of stereoscopic slides, which were very popular because you could view those in a special viewer, like we did as kids, which with the similar viewfinders.
I find it very interesting trying to locate where these pictures are taken. And since I'm a resident of the Heights for quite a number of years, many of us are here. When I look at this picture that you have up there, it looks to me like it's the tail end of Columbia Heights as it descends down to Fulton Street, right? And you could see where Grimaldi's Pizza is in that area. So the buildings to the left are not recognizable. We know when we walk down, we don't see them. But that's where the BQE was built, and then they cut through that. And the angle of the bridge, when you stand in Columbia Heights just before it begins to descend the last few blocks, you can see that same angle of the bridge there. But
Okay.
even when you showed Clinton Street, it fascinated me. I don't know where those pictures are taken, but some of the brownstones still exist. And to get them matched up would be phenomenal
Yeah.
to know, oh, that's this cross street of that.
I
and
know.
so on.
I almost wish that he just had the foresight to write down exactly where he took every one of these photos, but so much of it is a mystery.
And maybe he numbered his plates and he left some indication, and maybe he had some notes too. One other thing I'll say very quickly. A few years ago, in an online platform called Mashable, some remarkable photographs were released, and they were about a photographer called Wallace Gould Levinson, and who apparently they said was obsessed with taking pictures of action photographs. Well, guess what? Wallace Gould Levinson was Brainerd's protege. And probably Levinson didn't take any of those photographs, except some of the later ones that were that have been credited to him. So Time Life has 200 beautiful photographs, which are most likely Brainerd's, or at least taken, because when Levinson, there's a story of that, Levinson gave a talk where he showed off pictures taken with Brainerd's equipment. So Levinson inherited that. If you Google Wallace Gould Levinson, he's credited with being this remarkable photographer from the period, and really, I actually contacted Mashable to try and correct the record, but I didn't hear back from them. But I was in journalism too, so I know that corrections always go on like page 75, right? So,
To follow up on that, could he have taken this photo? Could Levinson have taken this photo of Brainerd?
well, he could have, because Brainerd did work. Brainerd, the few photographs that we have of Levinson, of Brainerd at work, he's often with 2 or 3 assistants. So that's the other interesting thing, is that I don't know if he really, if they even thought of like sole authorship. They were interested in a particular process, and they worked often in groups. So Levinson might have taken this photograph, or one of those other friends. Now, with Levinson's photographs, the later ones, there is a clear kind of compositional difference. Levinson gets closer than Brainerd. Brainerd seemed to want to hang back. So the later photographs that we know are Levinson's, he seemed to be a little bolder about getting in someone's face, whereas Brainerd tended to hang back. He didn't want to disturb his subjects.
Thank you. You mentioned how he was rediscovered in the 30s, but what was the reaction in his lifetime? Was there a reaction? Like, I know that these photography clubs the goings-on were breathlessly reported in the papers. Is he mentioned?
Yes, so the Brooklyn Daily Eagle has a couple big stories when Brainerd died. And in one of them, he's called the father of instantaneous photography, where he's credited with being the first person to develop a camera that could take a snapshot. So he was recognized in his time as really a pioneer. Now, he's rediscovered in the 1930s, and he enjoys this brief period of popularity, and the exhibits at the Brooklyn Museum are hugely popular. Now, in the 1950s, excuse me, after the director of the Brooklyn Museum, the photography director, dies, Brainerd photography, modern art is now the thing, and photography, I think it was not considered. It fell out of fashion. So the Brooklyn Museum even was going to get rid of Bernice Abbott's collection, if you can believe it, and I think a far-sighted director hid Bernice Abbott's photographs in the attic of the Brooklyn Museum, so they didn't get thrown away. But the director at the time in the 1950s didn't want the slides. He said, "Get all these." They were just interested in what could be printed and what were good prints, and so all these glass plates were given to the Brooklyn Public Library. Then, in the 1990s, there was Julia Moffett was her name, wrote a thesis, quite interesting, about Brainerd, and kind of brought some attention. And guess what? The Brooklyn Museum said, "We'll take the slides back." I think so. They have them back now. So that's interesting that someone from the Brooklyn Museum here maybe will.
We have time for just one more question.
I'm curious how you discovered Brainerd and became interested enough to write a book about him.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. That's an easy one to answer, and it's pure serendipity. I live in Haddam, where George Brainerd was born. We have a library called the Brainerd Memorial Library, which one of George's uncles endowed. And we happen to have a collection of like 30 or 40 Brainerd photographs of the Connecticut River. So those, happened to, doing some research one day, I happened to come upon those, and I was struck by, well, the ones of the river are beautiful, but what I found out is that he also captured things like, there's a photograph called The Ferryman's Daughter, and it's a woman kind of walking down the street bringing the lunch to her dad who operates the ferry. And he also had a photograph of boys skinny dipping, which is the way, working class kids swam in those days. They didn't wear bathing suits. And what I noticed, the boy was diving off like a high log, and he's frozen in the air. And I knew enough about photography to say, wait, how is he doing this in the 1870s? And so that kind of led me to research Brainerd, and I found, in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle that there was something, about him. And so if I didn't live in Haddam, if I wasn't born there and grew up there, it wouldn't have happened.
The one other connection with Haddam, isn't that right across the river from the quarry where all of the brownstone came from?
So Haddam is granite territory, but just up the river, about 10 miles, 7 miles, is Portland. And Portland is where 80%, if not 90%, of all the brownstone in New York and Brooklyn came from, in those quarries. I got to tell you, Edith Wharton, who looked at the brownstone, at these canyons of brownstone row houses, as like the emblem of oppression and dreary and dark. And she called brownstone the most hideous stone ever quarried.
I think I also read that she described it as like this chocolate houses, like drip like chocolate, just gross and ugh, yeah. They became very unfashionable, but of course, we'd all love to live in a Brooklyn brownstone today.
And just really quickly, there was a fellow by the name of Mike Meehan who resurrected brownstone quarrying. And I did a story on him because I used to work for newspapers. I did a story on Mike Meehan, Irishman. And the first thing I said to him, I said, Mike, you know the Edith Wharton quote, right? And he goes, it's engraved on my heart, Eric. He goes, she did more to destroy my business, So anyway, that was Mike Meehan. So he began, and what he did, and he supplied a lot of restoration. So when someone was restoring a brownstone here in Brooklyn, you could get stone from Mike Meehan in Portland, and the quarries are still there, and it looks like New York in the raw, kind of. It's just this beautiful chocolate-colored stone, which I don't think it's hideous, She said it was hideous. The other thing, it's a sedimentary rock. So here's what happened. This is really throw a little geology. When the houses were fronted with brownstone. Now, if you lay brownstone where the layers, sedimentary layers, are where they should be, parallel, it'll last forever. But what they did, because it was cheap, is they made brownstone veneer. So they laid it on its side. So once water seeped in, great chunks, as probably anyone knows who lives in an old brownstone, began peeling off. So that's why brownstone was considered, a bad building stone. But it was just because it was improperly installed.
Yeah, well, we could stay here for another all-night session of just like talking about Brooklyn and the Gilded Age. But I want to thank you, Eric, for the great photos. And thank you, Marcia, for putting this together. And thanks, everybody, for coming out.